Okay, in this video, I want to get into the Russian misinformation narrative and hopefully relate that to other narratives and in that process explain why it's being promoted. Obviously, the idea of Russian propaganda from the perspective of a Western mind goes back decades to the creation of the quote-unquote Cold War. And this is kind of the digital version of that propaganda. And it's sort of transpiring on two fronts now. You have this obvious example with the war in Ukraine, where all of the press that supports Ukraine's war effort is referring to what comes out of Russia as disinformation, in the same way that everything that comes out of the Russian press would refer to the Ukrainian press and the Western press in general as doing the same thing, creating disinformation that tries to make Russia look bad. Both sides acknowledging that this is a war, and part of war now is the virtual battlefield, quote unquote, which is taking place on the internet. And the Russian misinformation, fake news narrative in its digital form traces itself back to the election of Donald Trump, when the mainstream press in the United States of America and other similar outlets claimed that the Russians interfered with our elections to help Donald Trump get elected. Now, right away, from the start, this is not a genuine narrative, because we know that the presidents in the United States of America and around the world in general are pre-selected. I mean, I can't speak for the rest of the world as authoritatively as I can for America, but based on everything that was put into Donald Trump, all the things that they imbued him with, symbolically speaking, we know with certainty that he was selected to be president in 2016. He was going to be president that year from the day he was born. So the idea that the Russians interfered with our elections to somehow help that happen is absurd and kind of a non-starter argument. Like, we know that did not happen. Now, of course, because these things are nuanced and multi-layered and complex, yes, at the same time, the Russian sources could still put out information that could be traced back to Russia that was attempting to do this, that would give the impression that they were doing this, so that the mainstream press could plausibly, with some kind of proof, allege that the Russians were interfering with our elections. Now, the question is, why would they be doing that? Well, this relates to the quote-unquote conspiracy theorist scene on the internet, the quote-unquote truthers. When Donald Trump came on the scene and they associated Russian interference and disinformation with him, and then Donald Trump subsequently subsumed the idea of a conspiracy theorist into his campaign and just general machine, which had its offshoot movements through QAnon and MAGA and just that whole ecosystem on the internet. When he did that, or when they did that through him, it merged conspiracy culture in the United States with Russian misinformation or disinformation. It mixed it with the Russian influence. And as I've gone into in really old videos now, which I don't expect any of you guys to go watch, and honestly, I wouldn't even want you to, because they're so old that, yeah, there's accurate things in there, but I'm so different now compared to how I was then. I would explain it completely different, and I'm going to do a little bit of that now, kind of addressing those old videos. But yes, you could see that very early on if you were paying attention, how sites like Zero Hedge and up-and-coming fake conspiracy theorists like Jay Dyer had these associations to Russia in some way. For Zero Hedge, it was through Ivan Jinsky and Bulgaria. And for Jay Dyer, it was through Alexander Dugin, who is what I want to get to next, that whole subject involving him. For those of you who don't know, Alexander Dugin is sort of like a Zbigniew Brzezinski figure in Russia. He's a geopolitical strategist. Sometimes he's been referred to as Putin's brain. And he has this military intelligence link through his family. And he's been hypercritical of the Western world in general. He's even quoted as saying, the American empire should be destroyed, and it will be. So this is the kind of guy that Alexander Dugin is. He's very anti-American, and in that way he's playing his role in the creation of the multipolar world order, which is sort of what the new quote-unquote world order will be. It's when every country is brought to the same level so that a world government will function. And he's very fierce in his language along these lines. For example, Dugin supported the full invasion of Ukraine as representing a battle against absolute evil embodied in Western civilization, its liberal totalitarian hegemony, and in Ukrainian Nazism. And hopefully, as I read that sentence, you kind of got the feeling of, ooh, I think I've heard quote-unquote truthers say similar things like that. And isn't it interesting how these truthers have turned me into an anti-American individual, just in the way that I approach anything that the US government does now. I kind of view it in this way, based on what I have been told about it. And this relates to what they're using this propaganda to do way down the line, when it gets to the point where censorship of some kind of the First Amendment in the United States of America will seem justified. They will be able to point to the quote-unquote virtual battlefield that's going on, this alleged interference by Russia in the United States of America as some kind of new digital warfare, something that wasn't anticipated when the Constitution was created. And accordingly, the country needs to adapt to it. Look at what they're doing. This is very dangerous. They're meddling in our elections. They are turning Americans against their government with the propaganda. They're making Americans suspect of their government and lose faith with it. Likewise, at the same time, by using conspiracy theorists, quote unquote, who are telling the truth, quote unquote, about the United States government in a way that the Western governments don't, and in a way that the United States press doesn't itself, you conflate some of the truth that is accurate with foreign interference. And you discredit it in that way. The people who aren't aware of what's really going on, who haven't done the work of sifting through all of this and finding the thread that's woven through all the disinformation, the people who have not done that, who are still at the very early stages of all this, they're reading an article in the New York Times about Russian disinformation and Russian influence on our country, and how it's intentionally trying to destabilize the United States of America. In that way, they dismiss any of the truth that might be in there in some way. And so this is a way that you discredit the truth at the same time that you're allowing it to come into existence, because that's serving other purposes in terms of the revelation of the method and creating the conditions in the mind that will allow something new to be built from the ashes of the old thing. You have to destroy the old thing for that new thing to come into existence. So part of intentionally releasing the truth about certain things in this way is spreading that idea about what's really going on, so you create the momentum that is needed for change to transpire. And then once the people are ready for the change, you have already created the solutions that you just give them to take advantage of that energy and push them through whatever it is. This is the standard formula for any kind of false flag operation. The synthesis at the end of it, where you create the problem through the false flag and you present the solution in response to that you already have written or ready if it's something different than a law. You have it ready to implement in response, and you take all the energy that's created around the event and use that energy to bring that thing into existence without any kind of resistance to it. In other words, as we go forward, it's going to become more and more accepted that conspiracy theorists, quote unquote, at least the ones that are described by the mainstream press in the United States and other Western nations, are far-right operations that can be traced back to people like the far-right Alexander Dugin, who is spreading Russian disinformation in an attempt to destabilize the United States of America. So people will associate conspiracy theories with destabilization, and they will intuitively reject them. They will say, oh my gosh, these conspiracy theories are so bad. They're trying to destroy America. Look at this. They're destabilizing our country. And then as a result, when it comes time to censor things, you can say, yeah, this is kind of a new reality where this is a virtual battlefield on the internet. We have to take this into account. This is a very dangerous situation that we have to get a hold of. We need some kind of censorship going on, or we need everyone to have their own digital footprint that can be traced back to their ID, like the Spanish Prime Minister just recently suggested at Davos. We need to remove anonymity so we can prevent this kind of thing going on the internet that is very dangerous and is destabilizing countries as this new form of warfare. And you can see this in a bunch of different headlines, like the Tenet media story, right-wing influencers were duped to work for covert Russian operation. They have millions of followers online. They have been major players in right-wing political discourse since Donald Trump was president, and they worked unknowingly, that's debatable, of course, for a company that was a front for a Russian influence operation, U.S. prosecutors say. An indictment filed Wednesday alleges a media company linked to 6 conservative influencers, including well-known personalities Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, and Benny Johnson, was secretly funded by Russian state media employees to turn out English-language videos that were often consistent with the Kremlin's interest in amplifying U.S. domestic divisions in order to weaken U.S. opposition to Russian interests, like its war in Ukraine. But taking a step back from this, we know that the larger agenda that doesn't have any relationship to Russia is for the United States to be destabilized. Because it's going to be destroyed in the same way that those 2 twin towers were destroyed in a ritual. Hopefully you can see how this is a part of that. But at the same time, they can point to it as originating in a foreign country because later a part of the destruction is getting rid of the First Amendment or changing it in some way. And this will play into that. It's very elegant propaganda, the way it's all woven together. I'm always in awe of it because it's functioning on so many different levels. In addition to marking the 3rd straight presidential election in which U.S. authorities have unveiled politically charged details about Russia's attempted interference in U.S. politics, an indictment indicates how Moscow may be attempting to capitalize on the skyrocketing popularity of right-wing podcasters, live streamers, and other content creators who have found successful careers on social media in the years since Trump was in office. I mean, there you go. They explained the whole thing. They explained their whole agenda. Donald Trump was selected for this role, and all of those right-wing podcasters, that whole scene was artificially created at the same time to rise with Trump. And now they are intentionally affiliating all of that with Russia. They're merging it all together. All that stuff that was on the fringes of YouTube and the internet in general in the late 2000s and early 2010s, all that stuff was intentionally brought into the mainstream through Donald Trump and all these artificial fake truthers. And they largely have paper trails back to Russia in some way, so this whole thing can come into the spotlight in a way that it can be both discredited as a source of real information and can also be painted as some kind of foreign interference. Which just amplifies the idea that there's no legitimacy to any of it because it's viewed by the other side, who doesn't know any better, as pure disinformation that's completely made up because it's trying to destroy America, right? That's the intention of it. Or not just outright destroy America, but from the Russian perspective, destabilize and do things subtly in a way that their interests will be less affected. How Elon Musk amplified content from a suspected Russian election interference plot. Now, along these lines, sometimes things are just handed to you on a silver platter. And this is one example of that. I got into Candace Owens in the last video. On the scripted Nazi salute from Elon Musk. And this is from her Twitter account. A tweet from Alexander Dugin. Total support for heroic Candace Owens. And then they're talking about this whole Macron thing and his wife and all that. And this is sort of an example of that fringe stuff from the quote-unquote fake news, the nobody died, nobody got hurt idea coming into the mainstream now, where you have this elite gender inversion thing where they claim that every single person that you see on television used to be a man if they're a woman and vice versa. Right? Every single one. Now, of course, it's going on some level here and there, but the idea that every single person you see is clearly a psychological operation. This disinformation that they're trying to put out there to discredit any of the true examples, while at the same time popularizing some of these concepts to destabilize the mind in general, to destabilize your worldview, detach you from reality. Because remember, this is always going on in the mind at the same time that it's going on with the country itself. Things have dual layers like this. So everything that's going on in a geopolitical sense is mirrored in the mind in terms of what it experiences when it goes down the quote-unquote rabbit hole looking into all of these wild and crazy things that you can find on the internet, some of which have a kernel of truth, but the disinformation is in drawing you into these absurd ideas that have no basis in reality, and as you assimilate these absurd things into your mind and they stack on top of each other, you build this absurd worldview that is completely detached from reality, and then you become the meme that is the tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, right? You become the meme where you have completely lost connection to anything that is real because your reality is entirely online, informed by these people that are paid to lie to you, right? So you're just completely lost. But anyway, understand the weight of what I have just put on the screen. Candace Owens, who has this history with the quote-unquote far right, who was on the Daily Wire with Ben Shapiro. Her husband's a multi-millionaire. They're connected into all the usual places that these kinds of people are connected into. And she has Alexander Dugin calling her a hero. And she's reposting it on her Twitter. These are the characters that you have to really pay attention to, not in terms of actually listening to them. I've never even listened to a recording of Candace Owens, one of her things that she does. I mean, I've never done it. I have no need to. But I've seen clips here and there that other people have put together and put out there. I know enough about what she says from those to know that they've kind of shifted her role in all this, where she's becoming a Joe Rogan type of character for a younger generation. Candace Owens is 35 years old. She is designed to appeal to Gen Z primarily, and millennials as well. But they're kind of shifting her into this independent truther podcaster who can't be controlled by anybody, so now she's giving out the real truth. And in this way, she had this tweet where she said, "Someone said to me yesterday, quote unquote, claims of anti-Semitism are now just boomer cringe. So real." Hopefully the marketing behind this is making sense in terms of the generational warfare, where her message now is targeting a different demographic. And it's this Gen Z demographic that's been informed by TikTok about what's going on in the world, and they are very much anti-Israel. They're anti-Zionist. Because the anti-Zionist rhetoric is going to play into future things that will go on in that country, and just this movement in general will likewise be used as a part of the censorship that will take place involving the First Amendment. This is a part of what I was going into again in that Elon Musk video about his salute, where this kind of thing proves that anti-Semitism is on the rise. Now, ordinary people don't know that Candace Owens is paid by them to do this, to create this kind of thing. But still, it is going on due to her influence and others like her. For example, Candace Owens retweeting Ian Carroll, who just got to 1 million followers based on his interaction with Elon Musk, who intentionally asked him a question and promoted him. While they are doing that, the other side comes in and says, wow, Candace Owens, notorious for her vile Jew hatred and fragile ego, couldn't even stomach sitting through the rabbi's prayer at Trump's inauguration. Speaking of Trump, Candace Owens has interviewed Donald Trump, okay? You don't get to interview someone like that unless you're in the club. That's just how it works, okay? Do you think I would ever be able to sit down with Donald Trump and ask him questions? Like, that would never happen. So these people that are sitting down with him in front of a camera are in the club. And this is the multifaceted propaganda game that's taking place where, on the one hand, the things that she is repeating and the propaganda that she is promoting can be traced back to Russia. I mean, she's being openly praised by Alexander Dugin. And then on the other hand, she has this propaganda targeting younger demographics that have been raised through the pro-Palestine rhetoric and just that anti-war movement in general that is eventually leading to the idea that anti-Semitism is on the rise. I mean, that's just one part of it, right? And then they kind of lump all of this stuff together when it's all said and done, and it's, oh, well, hate is on the rise in general. Because this is just one part of it. They will also point to what Donald Trump and the far right thinks about the LGBTQ thing. They will say that's a version of hate. And of course, they call them racist, and they say, well, that's another version of hate. And all of that kind of coalesces together in someone's mind who doesn't know really what's going on. And they think, oh, yeah, wow, these people are pretty hateful. I mean, they are against all these groups. And I was raised to be inclusive, and this just goes against everything that I believe in. So those people must be bad in some way, right? I guess they are. They're just conspiracy theorists who don't know anything. They're uneducated. They don't have the degrees from schooling that we all have. They're just uneducated and they fall for this obvious Russian propaganda on the internet. They fall for these obvious grifters who are conspiracy theorists that don't know anything. Combine all of that together over many years with the idea that the media itself is covering up a genocide, and that's just how evil this Western media is, and you really start creating a generation that has a destructive idea in their mind about what they want to see happen to their own government. And that sentiment is what will be seized on in the years to come. We're only in the very initial stages of them building this in Gen Z and the generations that will come after them. And the tail end of the millennials too. But that thing is going to be led by people like Ian Carroll and Candace Owens. These are young people that have decades to go as far as being on their platforms spreading half-truths, because that's ultimately what they do. It's mostly half-truths. They give a lot of facts that are accurate, and then they distort the context so you can't properly place the fact into a larger logical structure that is what it is, that explains the situation. And additionally, to add another layer to it then, this is her bio, or the banner on top of her Twitter page, which obviously is a church banner, showing this image of what looks to be an Orthodox style church, which of course, has the Masonic checkerboard floor, because of course they're telling you who she is, but I don't mean she's an actual Mason by that. I mean, they just give you some aspect of the symbolism to know what club she's in. I mean, women can't even be Masons. They have the Order of the Eastern Star for that. The point is, Masons are in the club with all the other organizations that do this. So by just putting the symbolism of one of them there, you kind of know who she's fronting for. And that's a larger point about who created these churches, right? But this is the other aspect of it. This is that Christian nationalism aspect where kind of all of these ideas about the rise of hate, the rise of anti-Semitism, the desire to cut certain people out of society or curtail their ability to do certain things that have a kind of biblical root. You combine all of that together and you can paint this idea that there's a sort of fascist Christian theocracy that's trying to rise into existence. That's just terrifying to everybody, right? This new form of fascism that's represented by these far-right Christian zealots. So, along those lines, you have all of these quote-unquote conspiracy theorists converting to Christianity in some form. They each have their own way that they do this. All these guys who have the hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and then even people who are a little lower down the line, the people that aren't quite as talented, who get lesser roles. Ultimately, then, the long-term agenda here through this is the Bible and Christians in general will be viewed as anti-Semitic or hateful in some way. And you could arrive at some sort of scenario where Christianity itself in some form is attempted to be banned because it represents all of these things. Look at what they did through it, in other words. Look at what it caused. Another angle along those lines is young men leaving traditional churches for masculine Orthodox Christianity in droves. And the masculine is in quotes, of course. As a part of this far-right Christianity psyop, you have a lot of these characters promoting the Eastern Orthodox version of Christianity, which is practiced in Greece and Russia in particular. So inadvertently, as these people are brought into this ideology, they are supporting Russia in the terms of the propaganda, right? The other side of the media can point at this and say, oh, wow, now all these young men are even being converted to their religion, right? Look at this Russian disinformation. Look how effective it is. They're even getting our young citizens to convert to their religion. And I brought up Jay Dyer earlier. Note that he did an actual interview with Dugin when he was first coming on the scene. He interviewed Alexander Dugin and promoted him. So we know that he's in the club, right? Or we knew that back then just from this alone. But what does Jay Dyer promote? He's a quote-unquote Christian, which he is nothing of the sort, I guarantee, right? Jay Dyer is not a Christian. He does not believe in any of that. There are a few things that I will guarantee. I'll guarantee that. But he promotes orthodoxy. He's like this spokesman who's paid to have quote-unquote debates. There's nothing more silly than a debate. But he goes around, quote-unquote, debating people and attempts to convert young men into Eastern Orthodoxy along the way, in addition to getting them to believe that America is evil, which he does through the esoteric Hollywood stuff that, you know, pins everything on the CIA and exposes everything that's going on along those lines. And after this interview, all these years later, Jay Dyer ends up on InfoWars with Alex Jones. Jay Dyer ends up on Tucker Carlson, right? Discussing the World Economic Forum. And I hope you can see how the red pill ties into this as well. And I don't know the context that this is referring to. It could be the old Matrix red pill idea, which was all over the early conspiracy theory scene on the internet. All these people that are paid to put out this stuff. They always like to use the Matrix as an example of what they are doing, right? They're giving you the red pill. Take my red pill. I'm giving you the truth. I'm breaking you out of the Matrix. But there's also the whole red pill, black pill, MGTOW manosphere angle to this as well that Jay Dyer has always attempted to appeal to. He's always pretended to kind of be in the 4chan streets. He uses some of those memes. He's always tried to appeal to that young male demographic that would lead them to orthodoxy and start to create the trend that we're seeing now where all of these young men are joining into this. I mean, Jordan Peterson did it as well. The list is long and not so distinguished, shall we say, of paid agents who have been given the task of doing this. Even somebody like Gonzalo Lira, right, who died in Ukraine because of all of this, right? I mean, the red pill, the merging of that idea with the quote-unquote truth that's going on in the world and the quote-unquote truth of women, quote-unquote, right? I mean, that thing is an obvious agenda that's attempting to pit men and women against each other, to get us to dislike each other before we even meet each other, you know? If you have all of this stuff in your mind that's being programmed into you by the internet, you meet somebody and you already have all these ideas in your head, you've never even met the person. They might not be any of those things. You're not even giving them a chance, in other words. And many people are so depressed by the just state of the world in general that they just, you know, pack it up and I'm not going to interact with anybody anymore. That's it. And that's ultimately where this kind of propaganda is trying to lead you, though there are many different avenues you can go down to convince yourself that you have found the truth and it's justified in some way, right? Especially if you go the Orthodox Christian route. Well, now I found God through all of this and whatever I'm experiencing is totally worth it because I found this new church that's giving me the truth. That's so much better than anything I can get in the Western world or my own country. Just remember that the people telling you this stuff are interacting with Alex Jones and Tucker Carlson, and they're boys with Dugan, okay? Like, really understand what's going on here. This is all a part of a larger agenda. I'm just breaking down one little aspect of it. This is a thing to the point where US Cyber Command is doing reports on Russian disinformation as it relates to the war in Ukraine, but just in general, this is building that narrative in a very official way that can be pointed to later down the line. U.S. Army War College, Understanding Russian Disinformation. Government of Canada, Countering Disinformation with Facts, Russian Invasion of Ukraine. PBS, To Drive Americans Apart, Russia helped spread hurricane disinformation. Remember all that stuff that was going on during that hurricane in North Carolina? Where there were all the memes on the internet about how the government can control the weather and FEMA isn't responding to Trump supporters and the entire government is against helping these people because of who they are. Now, I haven't been up there. I've seen some of the videos about it. There really could be some kind of crisis that is not being addressed appropriately. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how they are using the crisis to spread this information, both about the rise of conspiracy theories and how dangerous they are. There were stories that were circulating about how people were targeting FEMA employees, these right-wing militias that are motivated by racist beliefs, motivated by hate. Now they're targeting government employees because things are so bad. These conspiracy theorists are so crazy, they're saying that Democrats are controlling the weather to hit Republican towns. That is, in effect, destabilizing the United States of America further, dividing us further. But you can point to it in two different directions, right? You can take the Russian angle, which PBS does here, and says, oh, look, this is an example of how they intentionally do this to divide American citizens against themselves. And at the same time, it's an example of how conspiracy theories that we're all familiar with that involve weather manipulation and geoengineering is being merged into Russian disinformation. They're making them synonymous. So that, to my point earlier, later down the line, they can claim that the source of all these conspiracy theories all along was Russia or countries like it. They were intentionally trying to destabilize the United States of America and its citizens and their belief in their own government. It's Russia's fault. This isn't a worldwide coordinated effort by people that don't have allegiance to any country. No, this is Russia that did this, right? So they create that alibi for themselves at the same time that they do all of this stuff. Again, it's multi-layered. Try not to let yourself get so bonded to one interpretation about who is doing it, because then you miss the forest for the trees.